All right, so today we're going to take a deep dive into GDPR enforcement,
Sounds good.
specifically for 2024. You send over this podcast episode, and I got to say, GDPR compliance, sometimes it feels like you're trying to hit a moving target, right?
Yeah, it does feel like that sometimes.
The rules are constantly changing, so it's important to kind of stay updated. But don't worry, we're going to break it down for you today, make it a little more digestible. I think one of the biggest takeaways from the episode we listened to is that GDPR enforcement is really intensifying.
Yeah.
Like they're not just kind of slapping people in the wrist anymore.
Yeah.
It seems like they're going after some like high-value targets. Like
That's definitely true. I think we're seeing regulators get a lot more sophisticated in how they're approaching enforcement. And also, the data privacy landscape itself is changing so rapidly with things like AI, the ongoing complexities of data transfers. All of that's adding more fuel to the fire.
Yeah, and one thing that really stuck out to me was they talked a lot about this focus on big tech, specifically when it comes to things like cookie consent and personalized ads, and that case against Meta,
Right.
Or Facebook, as some people still know it, in Ireland,
Right.
where they got slapped with a massive fine for tracking cookies without proper consent. And they weren't really transparent about how they were using that data for all that targeted advertising.
Yeah.
I mean, that was huge news, right?
It was. And that case really highlights a point that goes way beyond just big tech, which is that user consent is a major, major compliance hurdle for companies of all sizes. So, it's definitely a wake-up call for all of us to take a look at our own cookie banners, the things that pop up on our websites, and really think about our data collection practices in general. Like, are you being upfront with your users about what data you're collecting and why? And are you giving them real choices, or is it just kind of like a take it or leave it situation? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think, even if you do have your cookie banner sorted out, let's say you're doing everything right on that front. But then there's the whole issue of data transfers. Like especially after that Schrems II ruling. Things have gotten really tricky when it comes to moving data outside the EU. Regulators are definitely taking a closer look at how businesses are safeguarding data that's leaving the EU. Like, for example, they talked about that case of a global telecom provider who got fined because they didn't implement those standard contractual clauses, or SECs, properly when they were transferring data over to the U.S. So can you explain to me what are these SECs all about? I mean, I know they're important, but...
Yeah. So basically, the Schrems II ruling kind of invalidated this old agreement that the EU and the US had for data transfers. And it created a lot of uncertainty about how to legally move data between those two regions. So these SECs, those standard contractual clauses, they've become kind of the go-to mechanism for ensuring that you have adequate data protection when you're sending personal information to countries outside the EU that might have, different privacy laws. So basically, they create this legally binding framework that sets out these specific safeguards that need to be in place to protect that data. It's kind of like, imagine it as a contract between the data exporter and the data importer that says, hey, we're both going to uphold these standards to make sure this data stays protected.
So it's more than just like a check the box kind of thing. You really have to think about how those safeguards are actually being implemented.
Exactly. It's not just about the paperwork. You have to demonstrate that you're actually, taking concrete steps to protect that data. And regulators are getting really good at looking under the hood and seeing if those safeguards are really effective. So you got to make sure you're going beyond just, signing a document. You're really implementing those protections in a meaningful way.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, it's interesting. We've been talking about cookies. We've been talking about data transfers. But then there's this whole other piece of the puzzle that's like exploding right now.
Yeah.
And that's artificial intelligence. And, those algorithms that seem to be everywhere these days. Of course, GDPR enforcement is catching up with AI. I mean, in the episode you shared, they talked about that case of a French AI company. They got penalized because they weren't transparent enough about how their algorithms were using people's data for profiling and things like that. They didn't really get proper consent and didn't give users much control over what was happening with their information.
Right. And that case really highlights how those core principles of GDPR, transparency, accountability, user rights, those all remain just as important, if not more so, in the age of AI. Because AI can be so powerful, it can process so much data, and sometimes in very opaque ways, that it's even more crucial to make sure that individuals know what's happening with their data, and they have a say in how it's being used, and how those complex algorithms are impacting their lives.
Yeah, it's almost like AI is like this next frontier of data privacy. We need to figure out how to apply these principles in a way that makes sense for this rapidly evolving technology.
Exactly, and it's going to be interesting to see how things unfold. We're really just at the beginning of this conversation.
Yeah, and I think it's one we're going to continue to have. But for now, I think it's a good place to pause. We've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the intensified enforcement. We've talked about big tech, cookies, data transfers, and even AI.
Right.
But we've got lots more to discuss. So let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and delve even deeper into these GDPR trends.
Sounds good. Welcome back to our GDPR deep dive.
So glad to be back. Before we jumped into part two, we were discussing those high-profile GDPR cases and those steps you can take to avoid becoming one of them.
Right.
But I kind of want to zoom out for a second and talk about the bigger picture.
Okay.
Like, what are the big trends that are shaping the enforcement landscape in 2024?
Okay, yeah. Well, one of the big themes that I keep seeing pop up over and over again is this idea of data minimization. You know, that whole GDPR principle that says you should only be collecting and processing the data that you actually need for a specific purpose. It seems like regulators are really starting to crack down on companies that are just hoarding data. Just collecting everything they can get their hands on without a clear reason why.
Yeah, it's almost like we need to start thinking about like digital decluttering.
Yeah, exactly.
Getting rid of all that data dust that we don't really need.
Yeah, and it makes sense if you think about it.
Yeah.
Like, the more data you have, the greater the risk that it's going to be breached or misused. So, really, data minimization is all about minimizing your exposure and being responsible with the data that you have.
Yeah, and I think that ties in really well with another thing that struck me from that podcast episode we listened to, which is this emphasis on purpose limitation.
Yeah.
Like, you can't just collect data for one reason
Yeah.
and then turn around and use it for something completely different,
Right, right.
like without getting fresh consent. It feels a bit sneaky, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. It really goes against this whole idea of transparency, which is, one of the key principles of the GDPR.
Mhm.
You need to be upfront with people about how you plan to use their data, and you can't, kind of pull a bait and switch on them later down the line.
Yeah, it all comes back to trust, right?
Really.
If people feel like you're being shady with their data, they're going to lose trust in you.
Yeah.
And that could be really hard to rebuild.
Absolutely. And not only that, but that loss of trust can actually, impact your bottom line. It can damage your reputation. So it really pays to be upfront and transparent with people about how you're using their data.
You know what I'm hearing from you is it sounds like GDPR enforcement is really maturing.
Mm.
Like, it's not just about checking boxes anymore.
Yeah.
It's about really understanding and embracing these principles, like actually weaving them into the fabric of how your business operates.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. It's really about moving away from just thinking about compliance and more towards, what they call privacy by design, where data protection is baked into everything that you do right from the start.
So how can our listeners apply this to their own businesses?
Well, one of the most important things is to make sure you have a good understanding of what the GDPR actually requires
Mm,
and how it applies to your specific organization.
right.
No more burying your head in the sand and hoping it'll all just go away, because it won't.
Definitely not. The GDPR is here to stay.
And once you've got that understanding, the next step is to do a thorough data inventory. Really figure out what personal data you have, where it's stored, how it's processed, who has access to it. Really get a clear picture of your data landscape.
It's like taking stock of all your data assets, right?
Yeah, exactly. And once you know what you have and where it is, then you can start to put in place the right measures to protect that data.
And what are some of those measures? What are we talking about here?
Well, we're talking about things like encryption, access controls, data retention policies, all those kind of nuts and bolts security measures. But it's not just about technology. It's also about having the right processes and procedures in place to ensure compliance. Things like having a data breach response plan, making sure your employees are trained on data protection. It's really a holistic approach.
So it's like people, processes, and technology.
Yeah, exactly. All working together. And, this is not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process. You need to constantly be evaluating your data protection measures and making sure they're still effective.
It's like a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. Yeah. You got to stay on top of it.
So let's shift gears a bit and talk about enforcement action specifically. Like, what are some of the things that companies are getting tripped up on? What are the things that are leading to those big fines?
Yeah. Well, one of the biggest things is, Not having a sufficient legal basis for processing data. Remember that the GDPR lays out these 6 lawful bases, and you need to have a valid one before you can even start collecting data.
So you can't just say, oh, I'm processing this data because it's good for business.
No, not at all. You really need to have a documented reason. And that reason needs to fall under one of those 6 lawful bases, like consent or contractual necessity or legal obligation. There are specific reasons you have to be able to point to.
And it's not just enough to, like, assume that you have a valid legal basis,
Right.
right? You need to actually document everything.
Yeah. Absolutely. Documentation is so important. If a regulator comes knocking, you need to be able to show your work to demonstrate that you've carefully considered the legal basis for all your data processing activities.
It's interesting how this theme of transparency keeps coming up, right?
Yeah.
Like we talked about it with cookie banners and purpose limitation,
Yeah.
but it seems like it's a much broader issue that a lot of companies are struggling with.
Yeah, for sure. Transparency is really one of the cornerstones of the GDPR. And companies need to be clear and upfront with people about how they're using their data. It's not enough to just have some long, complicated privacy policy on your website that nobody reads.
Yeah, nobody reads those things.
Right. It needs to be accessible. It needs to be written in plain language that people can actually understand. Ditch the legalese and just explain things clearly and simply.
Almost like you need to translate the GDPR from legalese into like plain everyday language.
Yeah, exactly. And it needs to be easy to find that information, whether it's on your website or in your app or, even in a physical document.
Hmm.
You need to make sure that people can easily access this information if they want it.
That makes sense. And another area that I know companies often have trouble with is data subject requests. Individuals have all these rights under the GDPR, like the right to access their data or have it corrected if it's wrong or even deleted.
Right, right. And companies need to have a good process in place for handling these requests. They need to be able to respond to them quickly and efficiently and provide the information that's being requested or take the action that's being requested. And they need to keep records of all of this.
Like you need to set up a customer service desk, but for data privacy.
Yeah, pretty much. And make sure your staff is trained on how to handle these requests. They need to know what information they can and cannot disclose, how to verify the identity of the person making the request, how to escalate more complex requests.
Yeah, it's not enough to just have it written down somewhere how it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
You need to make sure people actually know how to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you got to be prepared for all kinds of requests. Some will be simple, some will be much more complicated, but you need to have a system in place to handle all of them.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about, those enforcement trends and those common pitfalls, but I want to make sure we're not overwhelming our listeners.
Right.
Like, what are the key takeaways? What are the things that people should really be focusing on to make sure they're staying compliant and avoiding those big GDPR fines?
Okay, well, I think the biggest takeaway is that GDPR compliance is not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process. It's about building a culture of privacy within your organization and making sure that data protection is just a part of everything you do.
It's like brushing your teeth.
Exactly, yeah. You don't just brush your teeth once and then you're done, right?
Nope.
You got to do it regularly to keep those pearly whites sparkling. And it's the same with GDPR. You got to stay on top of it. Develop good habits, make it part of your routine.
So what are some practical tips for doing that? What can our listeners do, starting today to improve their data privacy posture?
Well, I think a good first step is to take a look at what you're already doing. Go back to that data inventory that we talked about. Really get a clear understanding of what personal data you have and how you're using it.
Like taking a data snapshot.
Yeah.
See where you're at right now.
Yeah, exactly. And once you've got that snapshot, then you can start to identify any gaps, any areas where you need to improve your compliance efforts. And don't be afraid to reach out for expert advice if you need it. There are lots of resources available, like consultants or law firms or even data protection authorities.
You don't have to do this alone.
Yeah. And remember, GDPR compliance, it's not just about avoiding fines. It's about doing the right thing. It's about protecting people's privacy and building trust with your customers.
And in the end, that's good for everyone.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think this has been a really great conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about, the changing landscape of GDPR enforcement, those common pitfalls to avoid, and some practical steps that our listeners can take to stay compliant.
Yeah, I think it's been a good overview.
Yeah, but we're not quite done yet. We still have one more really important topic to discuss, and that's the intersection of AI and data protection. So let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and dive into that. All right, so we're back and ready to tackle this whole AI and data protection thing.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic these days.
It seems like everyone's talking about AI.
Yeah.
And, understandably so. It's changing so much about how we live and work. But it also raises a ton of questions when it comes to data privacy.
Definitely. I mean, AI systems are processing massive amounts of data, often personal data, and it's not always clear how that data is being used or protected.
Right. And I know the GDPR doesn't specifically mention AI. It's like a few years old now. But it feels like those core principles still apply, right?
Absolutely. The GDPR is broad enough to cover new technologies like AI. It's all about applying those principles of transparency, fairness, and accountability to the AI world, which, can be tricky sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about that. How do we actually make sure that AI systems are respecting those GDPR principles? Like, where do we even start?
Well, I think transparency is a really good place to start. Users have the right to know when their data is being processed by an AI system and how that system works. And, it's not enough to just give them some technical explanation that nobody understands. You have to explain it in a way that makes sense to the average person.
Like, because AI can be a bit of a black box sometimes.
Exactly. And, people need to know what's going on with their data. They need to be able to understand how those algorithms are being used and how it might affect them.
Okay, so transparency is key. What else do we need to be thinking about?
Fairness is another big one. We have to make sure that these AI systems aren't being used in ways that are discriminatory or that reinforce existing biases.
Because AI is only as good as the data it's trained on, right?
So exactly. If the data itself is biased, then the AI system is going to be biased too, and that can lead to some really unfair outcomes.
Like, for example, I've heard about AI systems being used for hiring decisions.
Hmm.
And if the data is biased, it could end up favoring certain candidates over others, even if they're not actually more qualified.
Exactly. That's why it's so important to carefully scrutinize the data that's used to train these AI systems and to try to mitigate any potential biases. Because at the end of the day, AI should be used to promote fairness and equality, not to perpetuate discrimination.
Okay, so we need to be transparent, we need to be fair, but how do we actually do that? What are some concrete steps that companies can take to make sure their AI systems are GDPR compliant?
Well, a good place to start is with a risk assessment. Really identify the potential risks associated with using AI, especially when it comes to data protection and privacy. And then, once you've identified those risks, you can start putting in place safeguards to address them.
So, like, thinking about what could go wrong and then taking steps to prevent it.
Exactly. And that might involve things like data anonymization techniques or privacy enhancing technologies, or even just regular audits of your AI systems to make sure they're working as intended.
And I imagine documentation is still really important here too, right?
Absolutely. You need to be able to show that you've thought about these risks and that you're taking steps to mitigate them. If a regulator comes knocking, you need to be able to prove that you're doing your due diligence.
Right. Because good intentions aren't enough.
No, not at all. You have to be able to back it up with action and documentation.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the challenges of GDPR compliance in the age of AI. But I want to end on a more positive note. Like, what are the benefits of getting this right? What's in it for companies beyond just avoiding those big fines?
Well, compliance isn't just about avoiding penalties. It's really about building trust with your customers and showing them that you respect their privacy. And, in today's world, that's more important than ever.
It's about doing the right thing.
Exactly. And that's good for everyone in the long run.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. We've learned so much about GDPR enforcement in 2024, from those high-profile cases to practical tips for staying compliant. And we even dove into the complex world of AI and data protection.
It's been a great deep dive.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. And to our listeners, remember that GDPR compliance is an ongoing process, but it's a journey worth taking. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay compliant.